The requirements for aircraft rockets did not slack off with the close of World War II. New rockets were needed to keep pace with the advances made in high-performance jet aircraft that would carry those rockets. And new weapons were needed to counter those advancing aircraft.
It was at about that time that we started looking at the possibility of putting folding fins on a rocket so that it could be tube launched. Finally, out of all of that came the design that went into the Mighty Mouse.
The 2.75-inch folding fin aircraft rocket, known as Mighty Mouse, was fielded in the latter days of the Korean War. First used in Korea and then Formosa, literally millions of 275s were fired in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam conflict. Mighty Mouse versions are still in use today by the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps.
We don't need expensively trained electronics or ordnance specialists.
In 1952, a review of the entire 5-inch solid propellant rocket program indicated that all effort should be concentrated on the development of a folding fin aircraft rocket for air-to-ground and air-to-air use.
Standard military aircraft.
We put the warheads on just prior to takeoff.
In 1959, this rocket, known as Zuni, was nearing fleet introduction.
To prevent accidental firing of the rockets. If you can see the target, you can hit it with Zuni because it's fast, long range, and accurate. And if you hit it, you'll knock it out. For air-to-air use, the spotting chart shows where the proximity fuse went off, near the target. If these Zunis had had live warheads, we'd have had sure kills both times.
Well, gentlemen, as I was driving out here this morning, I was frankly wondering just how I'd be able to write about an ordinary rocket. Now it's beginning to look like this rocket can do everything.
No, as a matter of fact, it won't do everything, Mr. Martin. We wouldn't want you or anyone else to get the impression that it will. We need nuclear weapons from a deterrent standpoint. We need long-range air-to-air guided missiles to kill high-flying fighters and bombers. But we also need a hard-hitting, reliable, low-cost, flexible weapon such as Zuni to be used in regional brush-fire type wars such as we engaged in Korea, Formosa, and the Middle East.
You did need it. Looks to me like now you've got it. At least for the sake of a lot of people, including my kids. I hope you've got it.
Yes, we've got it, right here.
Nuclear weapons received priority attention in the military during the 40s and 50s, and nearly every weapon eventually acquired a nuclear option.
As the result of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the average military mind felt that conventional weapons were done. And henceforth and forevermore, we'd play with nuclear. And in those days, nuclear, there was a kind of excitement about it. It was going to solve all illnesses. There would be nothing that couldn't be cured by nuclear somethings. and it was going to solve all power requirements. It was going to solve everything. And that was the attitude, and most people didn't know anything about it, but they were sure it was going to.
China Lake was not immune to this attitude. Since its involvement in the Manhattan Project, the station had continued to support the nation's nuclear weapons effort with work in explosives, airframes, and support systems. In the late 1940s and early 50s, a major effort was Project Elsie, which went to the fleet as the Mark 91 special weapon.
It was a warhead that was supposed to be able to stand total rejection, that is, hit an immovable object, not go anyplace, and still function, which meant that it had a very high G level in it. And it's still probably as good as any bomb that exists when you talk about the ballistics of a bomb, because it was very well and precision made. So it didn't have all the erratic ballistics that our current bombs have.
Rockets, too, were designed with nuclear warheads in mind. The Bombardment Aircraft Rocket, or BOR, was developed by Knotts to provide the fleet with a rocket-propelled ballistic standoff weapon with a nuclear warhead. Although special weapons work was a major area of effort at China Lake during this period, the station did not let that emphasis subvert its conventional weapons role. In the 1950s, the station developed a variety of anti-submarine rockets and torpedoes. The connection between the station and underwater work was made in 1945 when the Caltech wartime facilities of Pasadena came under Knotts' cognizance. The torpedo group became the nucleus of what would become the Underwater Ordnance Department and the Knotts Pasadena Annex. Released to the fleet in 1951, the anti-submarine rocket Weapon A was followed by the rocket-assisted torpedo, RAT, which gave way to the much more sophisticated ASROC. ASROC propelled an acoustic homing torpedo or depth-charge payload over 5,000 yards from a launching ship. Fielded in 1960, ASROC versions remain in current inventory, including vertical launch variants. Knotts also pioneered technologies for underwater ordnance in the 1950s, and Knotts Pasadena developed a variety of torpedoes, including the Mark 32 acoustic homing torpedo. Knotts participated in the development of the Mark 43, Mark 44, and Mark 46 lightweight torpedoes. Responding to the growing Soviet nuclear threat in the 1950s, the U.S. began development of intermediate-range ballistic missiles and strategies for their use. The Navy's initial effort was Jupiter. However, the Navy soon realized that its ultimate objective was for a submarine-launched missile system, and the Jupiter was simply too large and too heavy for submarine use.
So I decided to ask the Weapons Evaluation Group to study what would be the characteristics of a suitable missile to succeed that missile in these submarines designed for this large missile. And so China Lake undertook that study.
In 1956, Knox conducted an in-depth study of methods to improve the Jupiter system. The result? A shift from the large liquid-fueled Jupiter to the smaller solid-fueled Polaris. Knox experts analyzed strategic targets and conducted the most detailed analysis that had ever been made of the effects of nuclear weapons on cities. Knox studies allowed a far smaller warhead to be used for the Navy's mission, and they incorporated the integral re-entry body warhead concept into Polaris. The ability of the China Lake Laboratory to project the advance of certain technologies and to incorporate emerging technologies into a development program was also key to the program's success. Out of all this came the Polaris concept that was finally selected by the Navy. At that time, too, launching a missile from underwater was considered nearly impossible. Knox conducted feasibility studies, underwater launching tests, and various component tests. Pop-Up was built at San Clemente Island for underwater launch tests. And Skytop was built at China Lake for propulsion tests. The design and hardware development of the Polaris system and its successors, Poseidon and Trident, were strongly influenced by these studies and tests conducted by the station in the 1950s.
In my opinion, along with Sidewinder, one of the most significant things that this station has done is the work they did on Polaris and making it a feasible fleet ballistic missile.
It just turned out that McLean wanted to demonstrate some techniques for guidance and needed a vehicle to do it with. Felt there was a need, but it was in many respects more an exploration of the techniques for guidance at the beginning rather than it was a conscious intent to design a anti-aircraft missile.
Although rockets dramatically increased aircraft firepower, their accuracy against maneuvering targets continued to pose a problem. Once a rocket was launched, it would fly a ballistic course no matter what the target did. In 1949, at China Lake, a feasibility study was initiated of the development of what was to be called the heat-homing rocket. This rocket evolved into Sidewinder, the world's first infrared homing air-to-air guided missile. Yet it was a program the Navy had not asked for.
It really wasn't planned by anybody. It was not planned by the Navy. It had a missile and didn't see why it needed another one. The Air Force had plans to have a missile in Falcon, and it didn't see any reason to have one.
Although guided missiles were, at the time, specifically excluded from the station's charter, by the early 1950s, it seemed that just about everyone at China Lake was working on Sidewinder. Dr. Thompson and Admiral William S. Parsons, then Assistant Chief of Buord, enthusiastically supported Sidewinder and transferred experimental funds to its early development.
Well, there was some money pried out, of course, on the Sidewinder project every once in a while by gimmicks, you know, calling it a fuse today. It was a missile yesterday. Tomorrow it's not a missile, it's a fuse, and this sort of thing.
Although Sidewinder enjoyed some powerful patronage in the Bureau of Ordnance, not everyone in the bureaucracy was pulling for the program.
K.T. Keller had been hired by President Truman to be his guided missile czar, and we did our best to convince Keller that we were a viable program, but he decided to kill us. So we went underground. We didn't stop. We worked harder than ever.
The man behind Sidewinder was Dr. William B. McLean, a mild-mannered physicist and one-time student of Dr. Lauritsen at Caltech. McLean's career at China Lake was nothing less than remarkable. In 1954, after only 9 years at the station, he would become technical director and serve in that position for 13 years, longer than anyone before or since.
This year's Rockefeller Public Service Award winner in the field Science, Technology, or Engineering is Technical Director of the U.S. Naval Ordnance Test Station, China Lake, California, Dr. William B. McLean, Technical Director.
The Caltech Mafia that started the place, the Thompsons and the Lauritsens and the like, all respected Bill. And the initial Navy people, like Petey Stroop, all provided an umbrella of protection for Bill so that he could do things that subsequently, as the alumni became less powerful, subsequent TDs were not able to do because they didn't have the protection that the system provided Bill.
McLean was very shy. A lot of people, and me included, think that he was a technical genius. Well, he was. But more than that, he was an administrative genius.
Bill had an ability to understand what the state-of-the-art was able to do at any given period in time, and always was willing to adjust the performance to meet what was a doable do rather than putting objectives out which were beyond what the state-of-the-art could then accomplish.
McLean was interested in guided missiles long before he came to Inyokern in 1945. At the Bureau of Standards, he worked on the Bat glide bomb, devising gyroscope systems for stabilizing the missile. As head of the Fire Control Section at China Lake, he was acutely aware of a fundamental limitation of aircraft fire control systems.
The great difficulty, of course, with fire control systems is that the fire control system cannot take account of unpredicted maneuvers of the target after the bullets or the rockets have been launched. This caused Dr. McLean to feel that if he could put somehow the fire control system in the rocket, then the fire control system could continue to calculate the proper intercept point in space as the rocket proceeded on its way toward the target. Now, of course, fire control systems are rather complicated and they're rather expensive. And consequently, a great premium was placed by Dr. McLean on keeping the fire control system in the rocket very simple and very inexpensive. After all, with each shot, you throw away one complete fire control system.
Sidewinder was not an overnight success, as legend would have it.
Well, the first 12 missiles we fired didn't work. We didn't know why. We finally figured it out.
The 13th missile, fired on September 11, 1953, missed the F-6 target by inches and was judged a successful intercept. 4 months later, Sidewinder hit the target.
It was January 9th, 1954, January the 9th. It was on a Saturday. I remember getting up that morning and my wife was in labor. And went on into work. They were talking about firing this missile. Sure enough, they got it off, and it hit.
When we hit that airplane, that was really remarkable because they succeeded in getting the airplane back. They landed it. And when I went out and looked at the airplane afterward, and I looked up inside, I put my head up inside the wing through the rent that had been made by the Sidewinders and went through. And here was, the main spar had been broken. But what was holding that wing on? I really don't know.
The Sidewinder team now knew it had a missile. And Levy threw a small party.
Just everybody was working hard and having a great time and laughing and scratching, but we had a cause. The cause was, of course, Sidewinder. We all knew what we had here. And when I came here, I knew that my mandate was to get the missile out of the Mojave Desert and into the fleet. And I used to preach that to my troops all the time.
In 1958, Sidewinder became the first air-to-air guided missile to be successfully used in combat. Nationalist Chinese F-86 aircraft, armed with Sidewinder 1A missiles, downed Communist Chinese fighters over the Straits of Formosa.
I felt that this is the ideal application of the Sidewinder missile to suppress what promised to become a shooting war, because it made it clear to the other side that, hey, they were not going to be able to dominate the air. In fact, they were not even going to be able to compete in the air.
Sidewinder's legacy at China Lake was and is profound. Knots developed the principle of a simple, reliable, accurate, and producible missile with its own fire control system, and made that missile adaptable to a wide variety of aircraft. So successful was the missile, and so potent and adaptable its technology, that Sidewinder came to be seen in some quarters as the answer to any and every fleet need. Surface-launched Sidewinders went from Hamburger, the ground round, to Osprey, and finally to Chaparral, which was launched from trailers, treads, and even armored decks. Sidewinder-derived concepts covered the complete range from Subwinder to Spacewinder, and the combinations pitched, tried, and fielded over the years were legion. Bombwinder, Bullwinder, and Sparrowwinder, and even a few other winders hidden under names like Focus, and Hap, and Bullwinkle, and Sidepup, and Sidearm. There was a Foldwinder to be carried internally, and a Raywinder with radar guidance, and even laser-guided and dual-mode winders. Sidewinder has literally spread around the world. It's been produced and copied by friend and foe alike. An amazing success.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite. one of the great scientific feats of the age.
When Sputnik was first launched, I'll never forget this. I was out there one night. I wanted to see the damn thing, and sure enough, there it went, you know. And I thought, God darn it, I said. So I ran into the lab. It must have been on a weekend, and I joined Hack and Jane Wilson were there, you know. And I told Hack, I said, hey, I just saw Sputnik. And I said, you know what we ought to do, Hack? We ought to go shoot the damn thing down. He didn't cotton to that idea.
Instead of shooting Sputnik down, Knots entered the space race. The Naval Observational Television Satellite Project, the Knots Project, was a crash program in response to the Soviets' launch of the world's first satellite. They had Sputnik, we would have Knotsnik.
We were aware that the satellite program in this country was decidedly behind, and that the technical possibility of putting up operating satellites was fairly certain. And essentially a number of people at China Lake had already computed the amount of thrust would have to be generated to put one of these things in orbit.
I went to work to calculate, you know, what was needed. We rather quickly decided that a ballistic launch, an appropriate angle, would carry the rocket up to the proper place. It would bend over. All we needed was something to trigger the third stage.
The China Lake research team that explored this radical concept in space vehicles was headed by Dr. H.A. Wilcox, Assistant Technical Director for Research at China Lake.
The air launch technique, now under study at China Lake, will permit a satellite to be placed in a special orbit on short notice in almost any direction and from any place an aircraft can fly. The powerful 5-stage rocket vehicle uses no moving parts and has only solid propellant rocket motors for extra reliability. It is loaded aboard the standard fighter aircraft in the same manner as a conventional gas tank.
6 test launches were made without provable success. But some believe that one of the launches was successful and that Knots launched one of the first U.S. satellites.
My best understanding is that we may have gotten an orbit on the 6th shot, may have succeeded in being in orbit. We got doubtful signals on the first pass back over the mainland. And then we got no more signals after that, not even doubtful ones. So whether we ever got a success or not, I have never been able to claim.
Knotsnik marked the beginning of the station's involvement in space, which would include satellite launching, tracking, and propulsion systems, and even anti-satellite systems. Far in advance of today's Star Wars technology, China Lake was launching satellite vehicles from aircraft and designing systems for space-based research and defense. As the station's work expanded and broadened in the 1950s, so too did the number and scope of the station's laboratory and test facilities. Knots pioneered the development of high-speed test tracks. The longest and fastest of the tracks is the 4-mile-long supersonic test track called SNORT, opened in 1953. Facilities were developed to shake and bake and freeze and soak, salt, drop, rattle, and roll live ordnance of all sorts. New names joined the China Lake lexicon, like G1 and G2, and Baker and Charlie, and T-Range, and Midas, Skyline, and Crosswind.
I will argue that China Lake really became of age in, say, 1960 or so. We had enough experience in various things that we weren't afraid to tackle anything.
With confidence and enthusiasm, China Lake headed into its third decade. There was a renewed emphasis by the Navy on conventional weapons, and Knots was at the forefront of this movement.
McLean realized that nuclear weapons were not weapons because you could never use them.
The nuclear business is not very profitable if you're never going to use it. It's not very profitable if you do use it, in my opinion, so why mess around with it?
And it was in 1959 that Frank Niemeyer in Code 12 did a very careful study of the world situation and showed that, by golly, we had certainly better improve our conventional weapons. And he sold the free fall program.
I thought we would have trouble getting support for what conventional type things, but we really didn't.
Well, they sold the Navy on spending money on conventional weapons. Mm-hmm. And about 3 years later, the Air Force said, hey, me too, me too, me too. And they had been completely tunnel visioned on nukes. And so they rushed around and stirred about and put out a bunch of money and a whole bunch of contracts and foozled around and spent just gobs of the taxpayers' good dollars and didn't turn out a damn thing. And then we go into Vietnam, and they had to use our weapons because they didn't have anything. They had the silliest bunch that anybody could have seen wouldn't be useful.
Conventional free-fall weapons were far from being Knott's sole area of endeavor, however. By the early 1960s, Knotts was involved in a variety of military and non-military projects. Sidewinder continued to be improved.
The high-speed, high-altitude fighter aircraft of the post-1960 era will impose serious limitations on the Sidewinder 1A infrared homing missile. However, by exploiting the proven design of the Sidewinder 1A missile system, we can meet the more exacting air-to-air combat conditions.
Sidewinder improvements in the early 1960s included a more sensitive IR seeker, an alternate radar head, and a more lethal warhead. New weapons under development, such as Shrike and Walleye, would soon make their mark. Knotts developed the technology and hardware to provide the fleet with an effective night attack capability using forward-looking infrared, or FLIR, devices, outgrowths of China Lake technology initiatives. In the 1960s, Knotts started work on laser and optical research and development, with applications in guidance, range finding, and weapon systems.
The military pressures that speed man's probing of outer space have given new urgency to his search for knowledge about the sea. About 1/3 of the Navy's budget now goes for underwater ships and weapons. The Soviet Union now has about 500 submarines. Some experts say that eventually all fighting ships will be submarines. To improve techniques that enable man to live beneath the sea for months at a time, the Navy is studying a mammal that once walked on land and now lives in the sea. This is Noddy, a 3-year-old Pacific porpoise, 7 feet long, weighing 200 pounds. She's the guinea pig for a research project that could lead to a revolution in underwater weapons, sounds detection, and anti-submarine warfare, part of a much bigger program conducted by the Naval Ordnance Test Station at China Lake.
Knotts scientists began talking to dolphins. And they studied the way fish swim. And the station became a world leader in weather modification, including hurricane abatement, cloud seeding, and fog clearing. The research that Knotts did in producing chemiluminescent light led to widespread applications of chemical light for military and civilian use. Other projects at Knotts during this period spanned the depths of the ocean to the fringes of outer space. Knotts developed and built several small submarines for research use. Moray was a 2-man deep-diving submarine originally conceived at China Lake as an undersea fighter craft.
The basic concept of Moray started out as if you will, an interceptor submarine. Concept of if you had an underwater aircraft carrier, and the Morays were deck-launched interceptors off the aircraft carrier, you'd detect something and you'd fly this very high-performance, low-signature vehicle out to see what it was. And if it was a bad guy, you were armed so you could kill the bad guy part of the time that he could detect you and so on, because you were so small.
The Cable-Controlled Underwater Recovery Vehicle, or CURV, was an unmanned vehicle designed to retrieve torpedoes from sea ranges. In 1966, it was used to retrieve a lost nuclear weapon off the coast of Spain. And Deep Jeep, a research submarine, was the first U.S.-made manned submersible to descend 2,000 feet. Oceanographic research by Knotts during the 1960s ranged from vehicles to hydrodynamics and acoustics, marine life and communications, and the nature of the sea itself. Since its inception in 1943, Knotts had continued to expand the field of propellant and propulsion technology. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, much of this propulsion development work had found application in space exploration. The quickly modified stock components of Knotts-era spacecraft gave way to more elegant designs and solutions. The Knotts Soft Landing Vehicle, an early experimental lunar landing craft, made use of variable thrust technology.
Some famous footage of this vehicle, which it turned out to be at the end, pretty much the end of the program as far as testing was concerned. It was considered that the vehicle knew it had outlived its usefulness and committed suicide, in that during the detanking process, there was the red acid actually shorted, ate some insulation off of a wire that controlled the injector, and it shorted that transducer out, which turned the engine on full.
In 1962, the first successful launch was made of the Caleb airborne satellite launching system, an outgrowth of the work done on Notsnik. Concept and components for SIP, China Lake's experimental anti-satellite weapon, were demonstrated soon thereafter. Knots-designed probes were launched throughout the early 60s as part of a program in strategic missile defense, and China Lake lent its guidance, tracking, and propulsion expertise to a wide variety of space-related programs. In June 1963, President John F. Kennedy paid a visit to Knots. The station received more publicity in one day than in all of its first 20 years, as Knots hit the evening news in every living room in America.
If you recall, Kennedy came here in the spring of 1963, I believe. And, of course, we had more flag rank than the world's ever seen in one place, I think.
We had special badges. Those of us that participated said 1-63, and that meant that was the number #1 event for 1963.
You heard about it for months ahead of time, and it seemed so, anyhow. And they did do a lot of sprucing up around the community.
We did a firepower demonstration that was very impressive. We also launched a Shrike. The target was so far downrange that they had no way of knowing whether it hit the target. We didn't hit the target, but the president didn't know that, as I recall. We had all the different weapons that we had worked on lined up on both sides of the parking lot, and I had the privilege of standing by the Shrike weapon, which was on display.
But I think it gave all of these people an idea of the breadth of work that was going on at China Lake. And so that was 63. And as I said, I feel that China Lake became mature in about 1960. They've been through a lot of different types of programs. We've been through the Polaris. We've been through this couple of these nuclear weapons. We've been through Sidewinder and evolving things. We weren't afraid to tackle anything. We had the expertise here, had the basic capability to do whatever we want. So we went in everything from underseas to surface to air and to satellite type or outer space stuff. And of course, the competition wasn't that great anyway. So maybe that made us look better.
And I think in 1963, I cannot think of a prouder statement when asked what our occupation may be than to say, I serve the United States of America. We want to thank all of you.
In technology and development, for weapons, for weather, for submarines, for satellites, Knots had indeed come of age. By mid-decade two, China Lake's systems acquisition process, the mechanics and the discipline of the China Lake way, had been well established. Its principles had been proven with success and accepted by the Bureau headquarters. As U.S. involvement in Vietnam increased, so too did the station's support of the fleet. By the middle of the decade, according to then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, 75% of all U.S. air-launched weapons used in Vietnam had been developed at China Lake. Knots developed and fielded a wide variety of missiles, rockets, free-fall weapons, and other ordnance and supporting systems for our forces in Southeast Asia. China Lake sent its scientists and engineers into the combat zones to provide support for weapons introduced to the fleet. The station received feedback from the battlefield as well.
I knew Jerry Schieffer, and I'd seen him on board the ships in those early days, but I never realized he was from China Lake, or any of that information was being fed back into the RDT&E community. But I'm positive that it must have been because as a new threat emerged, there were changes made to the Shrike.
Carrier and air group skippers would come to China Lake for pre-deployment briefings and take the lab's operational perspectives out to the fleet. They returned to China Lake to bring the fleet's perspective back to the lab.
Every time a carrier would come back from Vietnam, they'd come through here and debrief. Every time. Well, it may not have been every time, but we had a lot of that. We'd hear get the cruise reports. We'd just know what they had done, what they thought was good, what worked about the weapons, what didn't work, where they were having their troubles, and they were teaching us. But we were teaching them, too.
Many of China Lake's best-known weapons were deployed during this period. Mighty Mouse, the 2.75-inch folding-fin aircraft rocket that was used effectively in Korea, saw its heyday in Vietnam. It was used in the millions by all branches of the service and became the most fired non-bullet ordnance in history. Shrike, the world's first operational anti-radar missile, was released to the fleet in 1965. It would become one of the most fired guided missiles in history.
And the warhead was designed to be a tremendous shotgun with pellets that would penetrate light metal and go inside and ruin cables and things like that. All we wanted to do is to take the radar out of the action.
My introduction to armed weapons was in Vietnam, and it was the Shrike. And that was all we had for the longest period of time, and the only weapon that could be carried on the tactical aircraft that I flew. And we learned that the Shrikes were very valuable in those days and could not be wasted.
Walleye, a TV-guided glide bomb that was released to the fleet in 1967, helped to solve two basic problems that pilots had faced since bombing was first used in World War I: hitting the target and not getting hit by the enemy.
The ground is a hard place to hit the target because it's so big. It's just enormous when you got up there in the air and you're going 90 miles an hour or whatever it is, 500 miles an hour or 700, and you're supposed to find some little thing, which if you were right up close, it'd be big. You know, one of those tanks is big. But if you're off a few miles when you're supposed to locate it, it's not very big. And it's a really nasty problem.
With the camera in the nose of the bomb and a TV display in the cockpit, the pilot could visually lock onto the target, launch the weapon, then leave the area. Improved versions of Walleye allowed the pilot to control and update the aim point after launch. On the battlefield, Walleye could knock out a bridge while sparing the school next to it. This highly selective bombing revolutionized air warfare tactics and altered military strategies. The freefall weapons program begun at China Lake in the late 1950s began to bear fruit in the 1960s. Some never left the lab. Some went straight to the stockpile without seeing combat. And a couple got famous. Rockeye 2, the anti-tank, anti-materiel cluster bomb, was used effectively in Vietnam. And Snake Eye selectable low or high drag tail assemblies for general purpose bombs allowed low-level bombing to be conducted with reduced aircraft vulnerability to both enemy fire and bomb fragments. Beginning with its early 1960s participation in studies and developments for limited warfare, China Lake provided customized support for the Special Forces community throughout the Vietnam conflict. From SEAL weapons and diving gear to non-irritating face paint, underwater explosives, night vision devices and signals, even swimmer delivery vehicles. Pretty much whatever the operators asked for, China Lake delivered. Needed on a quick response basis, these special warfare devices demonstrated that limited production, limited application items, although not cost-effective for industry development, could be efficiently developed in the Navy labs. NWC provided the Navy with its laser-guided bomb capability. The center began by modifying Air Force hardware and weapons, and went on to develop and field the Laser Spot Tracker and the Airborne Handheld Laser Designator. So successful was the integration of these weapons that near the end of the conflict, Navy aircraft in one operation knocked out 17 bridges in only 2 hours. The forward-looking infrared, or FLIR technology and devices pioneered by the China Lake team also saw broad use during the conflict. The physical development of the station, too, during the 1960s strongly reflected the needs of the Vietnam conflict. The COSO military target range, the Fay test facility, the Warhead R&D lab, the anti-radiation lab, mini-deck carrier firefighting test facility. And Echo Range, the prototype of realistic electronic warfare R&D and combat ranges. All of these responses to fleet needs.
To support the increased combat activity in Southeast Asia, the Navy laboratory community was tasked with a number of quick response programs. It is my purpose here to illustrate how, through these programs, the Navy laboratory can provide the technology, science, and hardware to help solve quickly the urgent operational problems of the fleet. Now, specifically in this film,
during the closing years of Vietnam, China Lake continued to do what it did best: support the fleet in emergency quick response fashion. 2 of these programs were conducted to bolster our ship defense capabilities. 104 days after program initiation, Shrike on Board, the SOB, was successfully used in combat. In the second program, in 10 days, Chaparral, the Army's ground-to-air Sidewinder system, was modified and successfully adapted for shipboard use. China Lake's effort during the years of Vietnam turned out to be the center's most productive in terms of delivering products to the fleet. The search for answers to operational needs often brought strange results in the weapon-a-week atmosphere of the war. Over the decade of the conflict, China Lake had sent to the field everything from missile systems to plastic wrap, from liquid explosives to face paint sticks. There were a lot of things, too, that were built for those soon-forgotten quick responses of yesterday that never went anywhere. But the ideas and the technologies and the fleet inputs were filed away in the lab's corporate base to await a new call. These hopeful solutions to operational needs demonstrated the capability, initiative, and incentive of the China Lake military civilian team. On June 30th, 1967, 2 significant events occurred at China Lake. The Naval Ordnance Test Station was disestablished, and Bill McLean left China Lake to head the newly formed Naval Undersea Warfare Center in San Diego.
See, that's when he wanted to put the whole Navy underwater. Cargo ships, everything.
I kind of think that Bill came to the conclusion that the surface Navy was dead, and the only way to go was to go underwater. Therefore, his essential willingness to form a new laboratory for underwater.
If you'll go back in the early days, McLean commanded a lot of attention back in Washington, D.C. When he went back there, people listened to him. And after McLean left, why, I think things kind of went down because they didn't have as much prestige.
And of course, then he left, and I had no such clout at all. In that sense, I've thought about it a lot. And, you know, he had tremendous influence, and could get away with things that nobody else could.
In 1967, the Navy reorganized its laboratories into so-called centers of excellence. Knott's China Lake and the Pasadena Annex were separated. Knott's China Lake was merged with the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, Corona, to become the Naval Weapons Center. With this consolidation, China Lake gained further guided missile expertise and more fusing expertise than it had had before. Originally a 2-site establishment with both China Lake and Corona laboratories, the new center faced various problems of adjustment.
I fought like crazy against it. That was when I learned you can get in any office you want in Washington while I was trying to get them to change their mind on that decision. Didn't work. The decision with 20/20 hindsight was the right one, and it's because of the drawdown in the numbers of people that we have in the R&D community.
The two-bodied center did not last long. By the summer of 1971, the Corona Annex had been closed and its functions and personnel transferred to China Lake.
The purification of bringing Corona up made a lot more sense to have fuse people close to the weapons and have what we, have a full spectrum weapon than it would be to have some guy designing a piece of a torpedo system here.
The fuses that we designed, I believe, are better since we've been at China Lake than they were at Corona as a result of that. Better discipline in the development process, more interface with the missile designers, a better understanding. I think, and therefore better integration of the fuses into the missile systems.
With the consolidation, China Lake had also gained new layers of agencies to be accountable to within its new parent organization, the Naval Materiel Command, and within the larger Washington bureaucracy.
The organization was getting older. Well, the whole development process and the whole weapons systems acquisition process and all that sort of thing was getting much more structured, much more disciplined, if you will.
The days of Knots doing business with a relatively free hand and beneath the umbrella of protection that the Navy's old bureau system with its Knots alumni helped to provide, those days were slipping away.
I think people got used to Knots, and we liked that, and it was something you could say. It was an acronym you could say as opposed to NWC. It was easier to do. They saw us being now lumped together with the other labs in a thing, and it was that may have been part of it, and it's hard to say. I don't know.
From the beginning, the isolated China Lake community was an essential element in the overall success of Knots. Perhaps more than anyone could have predicted in 1943, those intangible ingredients that turn a group of people into a cohesive and productive community had a significant impact on the military-civilian relationships and the quality of work and life at China Lake.
I would say it was unique in that it was a good chance for the military and the civilians to get together, and that's important. That's important, because so often the military off by themselves or civilians, but we just, and they purposely had the houses arranged so one half of a duplex would be military and the other half would be civilian, so people would mix.
And that kind of brought us together, because we had a couple next to us who was a civilian couple who were friends of ours for another 10 or 15 years. So I'm not saying that we were always apart. Technically, the fellow who lived next door to me by the name Frank Porter, I still remember his name, that's 30 years ago.
And there was a real camaraderie between all newcomers. It seemed everybody who lived there would go out full force to make the person feel welcome.
Everybody knew what everybody was doing, and so you couldn't goof off. Your peers knew exactly what you were doing and how well you were doing it.
we were in the main honest and reasonably hardworking, and that was all taught to us by the environment of the years that we spent here.
Well, I thought everyone was terribly interested in what they were doing. The wives were very supportive of the men, and it was a beautiful, beautiful community as far as I was concerned.
By the late 1960s, however, this community was beginning to disintegrate.
It was a life that can never be replicated, those years, until what I like to call the sociological revolution of the 70s, when everybody started to move out into town. And everybody said it was because the rent's going up, but it really wasn't that. There were a number of things, you know, that came together that caused that.
Several trends and events that started in the 1960s and culminated in the 1970s caused, perhaps inevitably, the demise of the original China Lake military civilian community. By the early 1960s, it was becoming clear, after 20 years of doubt, that Knott's was more than a temporary wartime base. It had survived 2 wars and, more importantly, 2 post-war periods. In 1963, the city of Ridgecrest incorporated, demonstrating its permanence. The Federal Housing Authority recognized this growing stability in the Indian Wells Valley and, for the first time, made available FHA home loans to Valley residents.
In fact, you couldn't get a home loan in Ridgecrest. Initially, that was one of the problems, of course. FHA thought, oh, well, we got burnt too many times by making loans and then having the military abandon an area or move to someplace else.
The other thing that's kind of interesting about the real estate in Ridgecrest is that for a long time they made a mistake thinking that the China Lake civilian mentality prevailed and that people wanted the cheapest houses they could get their hands on.
We went out and looked at those and they were so small we decided no way. So we came back and rested for a few years. Then when the Dieters came, we went.
Developers and contractors began large-scale construction of homes and shopping centers. As the diversity of housing and services increased in Ridgecrest, even longtime center residents moved off the base. Changes in Navy policy very much encouraged this movement. The Navy wanted to cut operating costs at the center by, among other things, phasing out civilian housing. Rents and utility rates were raised. NWC began selling, demolishing, and removing excess housing.
As you know, considerable construction has already occurred in Ridgecrest. This reduction in the number of Navy houses is merely to phase out older, unserviceable units. Whatever number is left, say 2,300, have long-range improvement projects planned.
I was very reluctant to leave the base. I mean, I really liked it there. I did not want to move out here. I had the hardest time writing Ridgecrest on my return address, you know. I was just very, very, very reluctant to leave. It was, you know, it was a lifestyle that was very comfortable and had been good to us.
And I don't know that it's particularly sinister. I think it happens as a matter of course when when you're physically separated a little more from where you work. It's not quite as easy to pop in at odd hours of day or night. People still do it, but it turns out you kind of get out of you got things to think about a lawn, your house, more so than when you just lived on the base.
Owning a home meant new responsibilities. Dialing the familiar 7177 for public works was out. Fixing it yourself was in. People left work a little earlier. Discussions at the O Club became less frequent. And at night, the Mike Lab parking lot was no longer filled with Sidewinder cars.
You know, you broke up the community, you broke up the camaraderie.
We had something at a high level which people back in Washington and other places, they say, well, you're unique. What's unique? They didn't understand how good it could be from a technical standpoint, a social standpoint, because they'd never really experienced it. So it's difficult to talk to people about it. But it is degraded by orders of magnitude.
The center's role in the community evolved over the years from that of primary landlord and provider of services to that of being primarily a good neighbor. Today, the Officers Club is gone. Many of the houses have been razed or boarded up. And to those who lived and worked on the station in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, life at China Lake would never be the same.
Even with the distortions of time and memory, it was still a great place to work. And we all regret that the climate, for various reasons, has changed, but perhaps it was inevitable.
The 1970s were difficult years for NWC in many ways. As U.S. involvement in Vietnam waned, so did the urgency of the war-dominated atmosphere at China Lake. National policy increasingly dictated that more technical work be contracted out to industry. Programs were canceled. Budgets got tighter. New technologies were forcing changes in the center's direction and emphasis. And the tightly knit military-civilian community of China Lake was quickly becoming a thing of the past. Changes compounded changes, and nearly every aspect of China Lake life and work was affected. During the 70s, too, the emphasis within the Navy changed from the development of new weapons to the improvement of existing weapons. Throughout the decade, improved versions of Sidewinder, Walleye, and Sparrow were released to the fleet. But several programs begun in the previous decade and nearing completion got the axe. NWC's Bulldog, the first successful laser-guided missile, was canceled in 1974 in favor of the Air Force Maverick. And Condor, a large TV-guided missile, was also killed. The center began the design of a radical new dogfight missile called Agile, only to have the project canceled before development was complete.
It was an accumulation of technologies looking for a home. We had a bunch of things come out of the technology-based program: a thrust vector control rocket motor, new warhead concept, new fuse concept, 6 new guidance control concepts. We looked at the shortcomings of the present systems and said, we're going to solve all of those shortcomings.
Another important change in China Lake's direction was being driven by the introduction of computer and software-intensive aircraft and weapon systems. Beginning with the A-7 Corsair, the center got into aircraft weapon integration and digital avionics in a big way.
We had no guidelines. There was nobody had done it before, and therefore we didn't really have anybody we could follow on how to do this. We were really the first people that did the software system integration work and so on an airplane system, a weapon system in the Navy, and as far as I know, in the Air Force.
During the 70s, NWC became the Weapon System Support Activity, or WISA, for a variety of attack aircraft. The China Lake WISAs develop, integrate, and test new flight control, targeting, and weapon integration hardware and software for the Navy and Marine Corps. Increased emphasis in the 1970s on military application of laser and optical technology prompted the opening of the NWC Optical Evaluation Facility and of Lauritsen Laboratory. The laser sensor and diamond turning facilities were developed, and NWC rapidly became a world leader in the development of certain optical and laser technologies. During the decade, the aircraft survivability range became a major endeavor. The solid state and simulation laboratories were opened. And in 1979, the Weapons and Tactics Analysis Center, or WEPTAC, was established. This computerized center allowed personnel to evaluate weapons and tactics in realistic, interactive encounters between opposing forces. Another important aspect of the center's system improvement activities of the period was a result of China Lake's unparalleled experience and expertise in systems engineering, manufacturing technology, and documentation.
We got into Sparrow because the documentation wasn't under control. It had failed op-eval. They wanted to develop a second source. They didn't have a documentation package that would support second source, so they hired China Lake not to do sexy R&D work. They hired China Lake because we had demonstrated with Shrike and with Sidewinder and some of the other programs that we knew how to transition to production, we knew how to control production, we understood the quality assurance and so on. Harpoon failed op-eval twice. We were called on to support that. We did, and it was through doing things like getting the documentation under control, making sure they had good configuration management, good solid quality assurance programs. Having done that and having satisfied the customer or the sponsor, then as they talked about improving the weapon, then we got in on the ground floor on the improvements. And Tomahawk's a good example. We were called in. They wanted laboratory involvement. We ended up with about 150 people on Tomahawk. Initially, they were almost all on production support. Our objective was to change that, and so when it was 150, half of those would have been doing production support, and half of those were doing R&D support of improvements and new capabilities.
Engineering discipline, documentation, detailed control of the development and production process. Fundamental aspects of the center's operating philosophy that time and again proved their worth. At the end of the decade, the National Parachute Test Range at El Centro, California was disestablished, and its mission and functions transferred to China Lake. With its history of parachute and aircrew survivability enhancements stretching back to 1947, the El Centro activity brought to China Lake new expertise in materials and specialized components related to aircrew survivability. One of the most important pieces of analysis conducted at China Lake came in the aftermath of the munitions train explosions at Roseville, California, and Benson, Arizona. Within a period of less than a month in 1973, explosions rocked 2 different freight trains carrying Air Force bombs filled with Navy-developed explosives. At issue were the millions of dollars in damage suits brought against the U.S. government and public confidence in the safety of military ordnance.
That was the question we had to answer first. Did we have a bad bomb? That was the first thing we had to look at. And I did everything I could do with the bombs, explosive, to make them behave in a fashion that say that we had something bad with that explosive. One is just try to know bad. We just should get rid of it. If I said it was bad, they would have downloaded Europe. And they said that that's what would have happened. So I said, I'll do everything I can see to test it, every conceivable thing I can do. I took bombs, I ran saws through them, dry saws, like this, nothing. I dropped bombs 50 feet, one, again and again and again. The same bomb, until it squirted out the sides. I put a bomb going down the track. Bomb sitting still, another bomb going at 300 miles an hour. One squished and burned. The other one didn't even react. Everything I could think of. And I called the admiral and said, I could not make those things act bad. I said, they will cook off in a fire, but the explosive itself is not bad. I said, okay.
NWC investigators established that Navy ordnance was safe to ship by rail and saved the government more than $50 million in damage settlements. These successful investigations also demonstrated the depth and breadth of expertise that a Navy laboratory can bring to bear on a unique problem.
So that was the first thing. The next was to get the explosive community to wake up that we have to know more about the properties of an explosive. That fire is a very serious threat. And the 2 carrier fires and some later fires show that we really need to make our munitions insensitive. So I think, in a way, that's the bottom line. As far as the attorneys, it's the first time when we actually went to court where the United States is being sued. We won.
The mid-1970s saw significant change in the operating philosophy of the center. There was increasing concern in Congress over an increasing number of programs throughout the Department of Defense. China Lake could not escape this scrutiny. Changes, too, in the Navy bureaucracy reflected to some extent the historical and philosophical differences of the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and Bureau of Aeronautics. The Bureau of Ordnance was established in 1842 as the Bureau of Ordnance and Hydrography.
Back in the old days, the Bureau of Ordnance had a whole establishment of draftsmen where they actually designed a lot of their stuff. Now we're not talking, we're talking about guns and gun turrets and things of this nature. So I think it was a natural progression for the Bureau of Ordnance organizations to pick this up and say, we'll do our work in-house.
In-house meant within the Naval Gun Factory, or later on, within Navy laboratories such as Dahlgren, White Oak, and China Lake. The Bureau of Aeronautics was established in 1921.
There were 2 growing corporate operations that were in the field of the Bureau of Aeronautics. One airframe manufacturer and the other's airplane engines.
BuAer typically turned to contractors such as Curtiss, McDonnell, Grumman, or Douglas to develop aircraft for the fleet. By the late 1960s, the acquisition philosophy of the Navy and of its senior officers was turning more toward this industry-centered attitude.
So consequently, the philosophy of the people who grew up in that environment, both military and civilian, was that you didn't do the work in-house. You wrote the specs of what you wanted. I want to fly this fast and carry this much load or whatever. You wrote it all up and you gave it to a contractor, and he delivered that, and then you went out and tested it.
By the time of Rear Admiral Roland Freeman's tenure as NWC commander, a large portion of the center's developmental work was contracted out to industry.
Doc Freeman was of that environment. His entire history had been the BuAer environment where you wrote the spec and gave it to the contractor.
Perhaps the NWC program most illustrative of this new philosophy was HARM, originally conceived as an upgraded version of Shrike.
HARM is a good systems acquisition program to study because it had every possible mistake made at least once.
HARM probably is the best example of how not to do something.
Now, the HARM program has been in political football all the way through, at every level of government. I've never seen a program in my whole career that has had so much attention by so many people and has been redirected or had money stopped, whatever.
The people in this center conceived HARM in the Vietnam area in the late 60s.
It started as an in-house development, and we had planned a rough count of 100 technical people that would be involved here at the center, just as they were in Shrike, just as they were in Sidewinder, just as they were in every successful weapon that had made China Lake famous. And in the fall of '74, when the contract for development of HARM came to the center, and it included the center doing a lot of the technical work, but including a contractor. Very significantly, we had learned our lesson: get the contractor in early, but you better know more than he does at all times, technically, about the job. And that was the plan.
It was the way a program really ought to work. It was a team effort with total trust.
And one day we sat down, and Doc Freeman took out his pen and he drew through the contract and deleted all of the significant NWC participation in the program. He deleted the 100-man technical team from being on the program.
And as a result of what he did, our contracting capability and process kind of disintegrated here. And it took a long time to get HARM out, and the price just kept escalating on the thing.
I think that we would have had something in the fleet in about the '77 time frame had we continued right on in-house. It's maybe '78 at the latest.
HARM was released to the fleet on the A-7 aircraft in 1983.
Captain Lauer had a great saying, you know. He said, this was after he'd been here for a couple of years, he said, here I am, the commander of the premier weapons development laboratory of the world, and nobody in the Navy has called me up and asked me to develop a weapon yet. What's wrong with the system when the best laboratory is called by the Israelis, you know, for help? The Germans come here for help. The Japanese come here for help. The Air Force respects us. In 2 years, nobody's called me up and asked me to do anything from the Navy.
By the early 1980s, China Lake's development work was in a state of decline.
Because I remember in the
time frame, people were talking about the good old days. One of the real advantages was that China Lake was controlling its own destiny in those days to some extent. At least I perceived they were. And in the 80 thing, we were already in a position where we were doing more and more support and less development. So the culture was to get back the development and support it. The spirit was always there. People were demanding it.
Under the leadership of Center Commanders Captain Half, Captain Lahr, and Captain Dickerson, and technical directors Robert Hillier and Burl Hayes, the Center's upper management attempted to reverse the trend of the last 15 years and to establish, once again, a viable in-house R&D capability. Part of the strategy was to support small teams of dedicated scientists and engineers working on specific projects to build up the Center's technology base. The idea was to re-emphasize the China Lake corporate culture, the so-called China Lake Way, and to re-establish the philosophy behind the principles of operation that had been set aside in a previous administration.
Bob got the ball started. When I came TD, I really started pushing hard through strategies and publications, and then putting our money where our mouth was. We really started pushing a lot of systems.
Systems such as the Advanced Common Intercept Missile Demonstration, which was used to develop the technology and hardware for a long-range, air-breathing, Sparrow-sized missile to be used in the outer air battle mission. Under ACIMD, NWC demonstrated state-of-the-art propulsion, airframe, and guidance technology. The HARM Low-Cost Seeker. In 1984, China Lake established this hard-fought-for product improvement using technology developed by the Center under the anti-radiation projectile and erase programs. And from existing systems, NWC developed new, improved, and expanded weapon systems. Sidewinder AIM-9M, with improved countermeasures and operational enhancements. Vertical Launch ASROC, applying NWC propulsion technology to provide new flexibility for anti-submarine warfare. Skipper, a modified and rocket-boosted laser-guided bomb that provided an urgently needed standoff weapon. And Sidearm, a 60s vintage radar sidewinder, updated for the anti-radar role with the incorporation of Center-developed state-of-the-art guidance technology.
When Paisley shut us down, we had 6 systems well into full-scale development. Which was pretty good, considering we didn't have a single advocate anywhere for us doing them.
Assistant Secretary of the Navy Melvin Paisley believed that industry was more qualified than the Navy laboratories to handle weapons development. He wanted China Lake and the other Navy laboratories out of the development business.
I mean, that was his whole thrust. He told me that when I became technical director and asked that we get out of that kind of work. And we said yes, sir, and ignored it for a couple of years while he was busy doing other things. And one day he called up and said, I notice you're doing more full-scale engineering work now than you were when I asked you to slow down. And we said, yes, sir. And he said, well, now I'm telling you to do it. And we still tended to ignore it because that's just not what we should be about. Our success was too high. And we figured he wouldn't last that long. You know, the secretaries never last 7 years. Our timing was unfortunate. We got a secretary and assistant secretary last 7 years. His logic ran that industry was more competent. Industry had more resources. China Lake's successes were on simple weapons like the AIM-9D. We would have never succeeded on anything complex. The interesting thing was when we put together the ACIMD program and was highly successful, we maybe only had like 25 people working on it. I had a meeting with Mr. Paisley and Mr. Rump, and Rump said, I know you can't succeed because Hughes Aircraft has 1,200 people currently working on MRAM, and they're having troubles making it work. If you remember from the Bill McLean writings, Bill McLean said you get a small team of very dedicated and competent people and get out of their way. 1,200 people isn't small, they're probably not dedicated, and you can't get out of their way.
Despite the ordeal of political infighting, the center moved ahead. The work of the center's WISs continued to take a front row seat at China Lake and in the Navy. Airborne sensors and targeting avionics, software engineering, human factors, electronic warfare and stores management, all the elements of aircraft weapon system integration and avionics. Weapon system efforts included work on the advanced bomb family, the Gator aircraft-delivered anti-tank mine, new Fay weapons and technology, and the continued development of fusing systems for air weapons. A radically new version of Sidewinder, the AIM-9R with its imaging electro-optical seeker, was demonstrated by the center, as were fiber optic data links, and advanced warhead concepts. China Lake had become deeply involved, too, in improvement programs for weapon systems such as Tomahawk, Harm, Harpoon, and Sparrow. The development of training ranges and systems became a big business area for the center. As did the development of full-scale aircraft targets, such as the QF-86 and the QF-4. Decades of China Lake developments in engineering and manufacturing technologies came to the fore during the 80s, as witnessed by the phenomenally successful soldering technology seminars and the establishment of the Electronics Manufacturing Productivity Facility. During the 1980s, test and evaluation efforts continued to expand. As part of Project 21, the Range Control Center was brought online in 1986. The RCC streamlined range operations by consolidating a number of widely dispersed test support and control functions. Facilities were added to Skytop to support tests of the huge Trident II rocket motor. NWC scientists and engineers continue to delve into the frontiers of new knowledge. new energetic materials for advanced and sensitive propellants and explosives, high-energy laser and optical components and technology, new superconductor materials and applications, basic and applied research in the physical sciences. During the 1980s, increased emphasis was also placed on the center's environmental programs, reflecting a growing national concern for the environment. Feral burros and wild horses were removed from center ranges and put up for adoption. Bighorn sheep were reintroduced in the remote Eagle Crags area. Protected animal species became front-page stories. And the potential for geothermal energy in the volcanic Coso Range was developed. With production beginning in 1987, the Coso project has been responsible for an average annual savings of 30 to 35% of electric bills at China Lake. The last decade of the 20th century, although only a few years old, has already shown tremendous change throughout the world and at the center. The collapse of the Soviet Union initiated the restructuring of international relationships and precipitated a reduced U.S. defense budget. The outbreak of war in the Persian Gulf reminded us all, however, that the need for superior conventional weapons was still there, and a new chapter at China Lake had begun. As part of a major reorganization of the armed forces, the Naval Weapons Center was disestablished. The center's RDT&E mission and functions were combined with the T&E functions of 3 other Navy activities to form the Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons Division. Words such as redundancy, downsizing, consolidation, and mission purification became the buzzwords of the day. The road was and is never easy. Yet at the very foundation of this center's success has been its ability to evolve and survive. From wartime necessity to post-war austerity. From an airstrip in the middle of the desert to a large complex of sophisticated technical facilities. From a center for rocketry to a center for a broad spectrum of highly sophisticated weaponry. And just as the present could scarcely have been envisioned by those first uniformed and civilian men and women arriving at Inyokern in 1943, the future of the Navy at China Lake remains a challenge to the imagination.
It's like the old thing that when the train business sort of went down, those guys who thought they were in the railroad business sort of went bankrupt. Those guys who thought they were in the transportation business did pretty good. If China Lake can figure out they're not in the weapons business, but they're really in the DOD defense business, they can probably do pretty good.
I gave a paper a few years ago on roles of in-house labs. It's still current. They are to infuse the art of the possible into military planning, to avoid technological surprise by recognizing the options that the enemy has, to couple technological opportunity to fleet needs, to maintain the tech base in areas which are of little interest to the private sector, to maintain specialized facilities such as T&E facilities or other specialized laboratory facilities for general use, to have a team available to respond in time of national crisis, and to be the smart buyer during engineering development. It's my view that that latter role is the reason for being of a center such as this, of being the conscience and the technical watchdog of the Navy as it acquires its systems. It's been our fundamental role, will be so in the future. Sometimes we'll have that role from the point of view of being designer and controller, as we have been on every variant so far of Sidewinder. Sometimes it'll be as an advisor. Tomahawk or Harpoon are examples, and sometimes in between those two extremes. The laboratories will be able to be more than contract monitors if they want to. That takes a conscious recognition of that propensity and consciously rejecting it.
The in-house laboratories of the Navy are unique institutions, and China Lake unique among that cadre. China Lake brought to the Navy the advanced technologies, the engineering disciplines, and the integrated laboratory operational perspective that resulted in the Navy industry team that proved so phenomenally successful during the years of China Lake's growth and maturity. Not to say that the China Lake team made no mistakes along the way. It did. The station, the center, learned some hard lessons over the course of its evolution. It won many battles, but it lost many too. In the long run, the China Lake experience proves that when given a certain amount of freedom within an atmosphere of technical expertise, available facilities for basic RDT&E, and close operating relationships with the military community, the individual and corporate creativity characteristic of the laboratory community can arise to resolve operational problems and meet military needs, and to lay the groundwork for further developments. This, perhaps, is China Lake's legacy. Foundations well laid for the future. As to how those foundations are built upon, the next 50 years will tell.